Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to take a bit more, probably of a clinical approach and talk a little bit about why we might be seeing potential increases in aggression among people who use crystal meth and what we might be able to do about it. You've probably seen this little gem of an ad from the federal government a couple of years ago, and it pretty much reflects what we've seen in the media about the focus of crystal meth, particularly around the increased levels of violence among that group. And it's frightening, right? And it's scared the community significantly, so much so that now for the first time methamphetamine is the drug of most concern in the general community, despite the fact that alcohol is 10 times worse in terms of violence, aggression and harms to self and others. But also what I've noticed, I've been working with this group clinically and in research for more than 15 years, and what I've noticed is that practitioners are also scared. And as Ainsley said, when we're fearful, we don't respond very well. And so I think we need to take a little bit of heat out and figure out what's going on so that we can respond effectively. So it's a drug of most concern in the community and among practitioners, despite the fact, sorry about this messy graph, just look at the dark line. You can see that the rate of methamphetamine use in the general community has been steadily decreasing for the last 20 years. What has happened though in the last few years is that the choice of form of methamphetamine has changed. So these columns reflect the use of speed or the powdered form in the community, and among people who use meth, the preference has decreased for speed and has increased for the crystal form, which we call on the streets ice. These are exactly the same drug. If you use enough speed, you'll get the same effects as ice. They're all methamphetamine. It's a little bit like, I think of it kind of if you think of an alcohol analogy, speed is kind of like light beer. Ice is kind of like vodka. So if you have a can of light beer, that's about one standard drink. You'd probably feel quite okay, but you wouldn't feel terribly intoxicated. But if you drank 285 mils of straight vodka, that's about 10 standard drinks. You'd probably be under the table. And that's really the difference. They look different, they taste different, they're made differently, but they're still all alcohol, same with speed and ice. So really we're talking about methamphetamine rather than ice. So we've seen a shift in the way people have used to more dangerous forms, and we've absolutely seen an increase in presentations at the clinical end and problems at the clinical end. So increases in treatment presentations, hospital separations, emergency department and ambulance call-outs. However, there's no clear causal link between using crystal meth or any other type of methamphetamine and violent behaviour. And that'll surprise many of you, I'm sure. But we don't think that acute intoxication alone is directly responsible for the violent behaviour that's been associated with methamphetamine. And it's still a relatively small proportion of the greater number of people who use methamphetamine. However, in our context, so in hospitals, in community health services, and particularly in emergency departments and mental health, we see the pointy end. We necessarily see the pointy end because that's what our jobs are. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about why, if it's not directly to do with the drug itself, why people might become more hypersensitive and might become more aggressive and violent when they're using meth. So methamphetamine has a really complex effect on the brain. But particularly it raises the level of a number of neurochemicals. Serotonin as I'm sure you all know, is the kind of mood enhancer. It's the neurochemical that's increased when people take ecstasy. And if you've ever seen anyone on ecstasy, you're beautiful and I love you and everything's so wonderful, fabulous. And that is also increased with methamphetamine, but particularly if we're talking about aggression and violence, the two neurochemicals that are implicated are noradrenaline and dopamine. So noradrenaline is the thing that activates our fight or flight system. It increases arousal and increases energy. And so you can already see if there's an artificial increase in noradrenaline, how that's going to impact on aggression and violence. So methamphetamine, every time you use methamphetamine, you get an extra burst of noradrenaline, means that your fight or flight system is artificially switched on. And that means that things that we might not normally see as threatening become threatening. So we talk about an increase in threat sensitivity. So it doesn't directly cause violent behaviour, but it increases a sense of threat around. The other thing that it increases is the level of dopamine. You know that dopamine is the pleasure neurochemical. It's also our reward system. Every time we do something nice, you get a little burst of dopamine and it tells our brain to do it again. But the other thing about dopamine is that there's a couple of parts of our brain that need it to function well. The first part is the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe, which is involved in thinking and planning and decision making. And the second part is in the centre of the brain, the limbic system, which is responsible for emotional and social processing and memories. But particularly, these are where the dopamine pathways run in the brain, directly through the prefrontal cortex, the thinking area, and the limbic system. And initially, if you take methamphetamine at low doses, those areas are enhanced, so you get extra dopamine. But if you get too much dopamine, and you're using too much, or you're using over a long period of time, those systems they get stuffed up, basically. And they start to shut down if you're using over a long period of time. Not only do those two areas need dopamine to function, but they need to be talking to each other all the time. So you walking through a dark alley and something jumps out at you, your limbic system says, holy cow. And the prefrontal cortex then says, don't worry, just a cat, calm down. So they're doing this all of the time. But if there's no dopamine, or there's the dopamine system's out of whack, it can't do that. So you get a lot of emotional dysregulation from the limbic system. So combining those two things, you can see how threat sensitivity might be raised, and also emotion dysregulation is increased as well. The other thing about meth is that an increase in dopamine is also associated with psychotic symptoms. So if you're taking a lot of methamphetamine, you get a huge increase in dopamine. You're much more likely to have paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, a whole range of things like that. And those things are also associated with a higher level of threat sensitivity. If I'm paranoid and I think someone's spying on me, or I think someone's looking at me, I'm going to be much more hypervigilant to threat than if I didn't have that. So we've got a situation then where there's methamphetamine doesn't necessarily directly increase violence, but it increases threat sensitivity, it decreases emotional regulation, and it increases symptoms of psychosis. So you can see how all of that packaged together might be a risk factor. The thing is, I think this is quite a good thing, because it does mean that we have much more control over how people might respond. If it was just a direct relationship, there's nothing much we can do. So when I talk to people about managing aggression among meth users, you'll see this continuum. You've probably seen this before if you've had management of aggression training. Whatever you normally do with someone who's aggressive on that continuum, you would do with someone who was aggressive because they've used meth. It makes absolutely no difference why they're aggressive or violent. The reactions are going to be the same. So at this bottom end, where they're kind of jittery and a bit irritated, what we're trying to do is to not make things worse. So an example of making things worse, someone who was using meth relayed a story to me of going to emergency. He said that he was feeling really paranoid. He's starting to get some psychotic symptoms. He wanted to go to someone to help him kind of calm down. He went to the emergency department and said, I'm feeling really shit, and can you just give me something to take the edge off? Of course, the emergency department has protocols, they have a triage system, they have a way of doing things, and they said, your arm's not falling off and you're not having a heart attack, so you need to go sit over there and we'll get to you in a second. And that is absolutely the right thing to do in an emergency department, but it's an aggravating thing to do if you're on meth and you're hyped up and you're ready for kind of threat, or your emotions aren't being regulated very well. So he came back a couple of times and he said, I'm really, really feeling bad now. Can you just give me something to take the edge off? And they kept sending him back to the waiting area. And eventually he got really cranky and aggressive and violent, and they had to jump him with the security. So that's a situation we're kind of shoehorning, in some ways we're kind of shoehorning people who use methamphetamine and other drugs into a system that's not really designed for them. So we need to kind of think a little bit broadly about our systems and how we might be able to do some things differently in order to reduce that level of aggression and violence. I was presenting to the consult liaison alcohol and drug nurses last week in Queensland, and one of their hospitals, it has implemented a system that I can't remember what it's called, shift, something like that, where low priority but easy, high risk, low priority, easy clients, easy patients, have a separate triage system. So people like that would just get a sedative very quickly and then get sent on their way, because that's lowered the incidence of in the ED significantly since they implemented that. So you can see these are some of the things that we say to people in terms of just talking to someone who has been using methamphetamine, and you can see they're all the things that you already know how to do. So again, what I want to say to you is that all of the management of aggression training that you've had and any responses that you have with people with methamphetamine are exactly the same as our responses for anyone else who's aggressive or violent. Sorry, and I would just go back to this thing here. I didn't finish half this sentence, but in jitter and irritated, we're trying to not make things worse. Around the middle area where people are starting to get angry, we're trying to de-escalate and use all the same de-escalation skills that we use for other people. And then when people are physically aggressive and violent, we're implementing our safety measures exactly the same way. One of the things that I've noticed is two things among practitioners who are responding. We can make things worse if we're fearful and we respond aggressively ourselves or in a defensive way, and often it's because we are taking things personally, but we have to understand that brain functioning's not that great. They might have drugs on board, and they may not be rational and may not be responding in a rational way. And this is a quote from Marsha Linehan, who developed dialectical behaviour therapy for borderline personality disorder, but I like to think about this for everybody when I respond to everybody in the community and my clients, is that really people get aggressive because their needs aren't being met. They might not be the needs things that we think they need, but ultimately everybody is doing the best they can in that moment. And if they could do better, they absolutely would. And that helps me to kind of step back and not respond in an ineffective way. I want to just note, can I do an ad? Is that okay? Yeah. We've been contracted among a whole lot of other providers, but we have the broader health sector to provide ICE training for frontline workers. They're half-day training sessions, and if you go to our website, which is not on there, it's www.360edge.com.au, you will see all of the sessions across the state for half-day training on managing responding to ICE use if you're interested in that. Thank you.